So today's session is on the effects of firm heterogeneity in global trade. And this session was organized by Zeynep Agol at the Center for Global Trade Analysis in Purdue University. Tom Hurdle is kind enough to be the session host. So for those of you who are just joining now, Tom will be keeping track of the time a bit. So he's going to give all the session presenters their 2-minute warning. So my name is Caitlin Carico. I'm at Wageningen Economic Research in The Hague in the Netherlands, and I'm going to be chairing the session today. Okay, so we're going to start out with a presentation by Mike Byrne at the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. So his presentation is entitled Agri-Food Trade and GTAP Het Returns to Scale in Agriculture and the Millets Model. So he's looking at fixed and variable cost share data from the USDA and also from the European National Farm Business Surveys. So he's implementing some new data, and so that's going to be very exciting. Next, we're going to hear from Reno Sigas, the U.S. International Trade Commission. So his report is entitled Potential Productivity Effects of the U.S. Trade Agreements, and he's going to be looking at U.S. trade agreements implemented between 1984 and 2016. Then we're going to hear from Zeynep Agol, again at the Center for Global Trade Analysis at Purdue University. And her report is entitled Analyzing the Effects of Free Trade Agreements in a Millet CGE Model, Evidence from Turkey, UK, FTA. So she's going to tell us this is the first post-Brexit trade deal, and it's for the automotive sector, which is an important sector. Finally, last but not least, we will hear from David Tarr of the Laboratory of International Trade at the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration. And his report is entitled Mathematics of Generalized Versions of the Millets, Krugman, and Armington Models with Detailed Derivations. And David is going to sort of look at a variety of different extensions of the basic international trade model with heterogeneous firms and assessing the relative welfare implications of trade cost reductions in these different models. So it's a very exciting session. And now I will turn it over to Mike Byrne to start with his presentation.
Thank you, Caitlin. So I'll just share. Have you got that yet?
I'm not seeing it yet.
Not yet.
Looks like bandwidth issues a little bit. Keep trying here.
I can't hear anyone. Can someone give me a...
Mike, we're not seeing... Oh, there you go.
Okay.
It's
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. Whatever time of day it is, greetings to you. So I'm Mike Byrne from the UK Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. This work came out of last year's GTAP Het course. So thanks to Zeynep for being the tutor on that, and to Edgar Cook from Ashesi University in Ghana, who I collaborated with on the research project, and to Claire and Lee, my colleagues from DEFRA. I should say this is very much a work in progress, and I'm keen for collaborators, really. So if you're at all interested, I'm looking for kind of regional specialists on the data to expand the work. So my email address will be at the end, or do say in the chat. So the motivation behind this work, I work as a trade policy analyst, and it's clear that trade policymakers want to know when we're negotiating free trade agreements and other liberalizations, what are the opportunities for the kind of most efficient producers to expand, and what are the opportunities for consumers to benefit from increased choice and lower food prices. But they're hypersensitive, particularly in the agri-food space, to what are the threats to less efficient producers from increased competition. And most of you will be aware that agriculture is often a big sticking point in trade liberalization discussions. And also, what are the threats in terms of standards? I'm not really going to address that much in this presentation. I should say another opportunity which I've not put up there is the macroeconomic gains from resource allocation from liberalization. In my experience, policymakers often need a bit more convincing on that score. It's not as directly obvious to them. And so we have a role as economists to communicate that. And I think the models can help with that. So I'm keen to expand the Mellets model in CGE to the agri-food sectors, because I think it offers some really exciting opportunities. And the main one of those really is relating to what we can say about firms expanding or leaving the sector as a result of the liberalization, and also about the endogenous productivity response. And that's often a disagreement in policy circles. Is the liberalization a threat to the industry because it will cause firms to leave the sector? Or is it an opportunity because it'll provoke an endogenous productivity response, which will be have an overall good effect on the competitiveness of the industry? And I think the Mellets extension allows us to say something about that, where the kind of standard perfect competition CRTS treatment limits our ability. And also the love of variety effects for consumers, which is always of interest to ministers as well. But as with everything, there are some complicating factors which are specific to agriculture, as anyone who's worked on the sector will know. So the most fundamental is this question of returns to scale. I guess the whole point of this project is to try and say something about whether the constant returns to scale assumption is appropriate in agriculture. It's one that's commonly made. Even CGE models which do expand into Mellets and heterogeneous firms in some sectors often assume constant returns to scale in agriculture. I was provoked, I guess, by the observation that there are often high levels of productivity variability within the agricultural sector, certainly in the UK and in some other countries. And that suggests to me that we might want to question the kind of CRTS and perfect competition assumptions. But that's kind of the fundamental question that's motivated this work. And as we'll see, I'm afraid that the results are slightly ambiguous. Subsidies are, of course, another complicating factor. They complicate things in two ways that are relevant here. One is that they can tend to keep firms in business that would otherwise have gone out of business. And two is that when we use a kind of fixed cost approach, which we do here, particularly when payments are decoupled from production, as they often are, and have been particularly in the EU historically, arguably those should be netted out. They're a kind of fixed benefit that should be netted out from fixed costs. So I've taken that approach here, but I've also, for comparison, kind of not done that. And then finally, indirect trade. So lots of agricultural goods are traded after processing or through an intermediary. And that's an important factor, but I'd refer you to, Train's 2012 PhD thesis goes into quite a lot of detail on why, although it's an important factor, it doesn't invalidate the Mellets treatment in agriculture. So this method draws quite heavily on the GTAP Het implementation paper by Akgol et al. 2016. And the method taken there is essentially to take kind of elasticity of substitution between varieties estimates from the literature and then use those to derive some of these other variables, like fixed cost shares and also industry markup and the productivity distribution shape parameter. I'm coming at it using that same method, but from a slightly different direction. And then I'm starting with the fixed cost shares, using those to derive the elasticities of substitution and then the other variables. So I'm going to spend probably the majority of my time looking at those fixed cost shares and the variables we can derive from them. So a couple of definitions. When you see gross in the slides that follow, that's just fixed costs over total costs. When you see net, that's the fixed costs minus subsidies over the total cost minus subsidies. I'll admit I was a little bit unsure whether subsidies should be netted out from the numerator there as well. So if you've got strong views on that, let me know. But I have netted them out. And then I've picked 3 illustrative examples based really on the accessibility of data. So the USA and the EU each publish quite extensive data on kind of some estimates of fixed and total costs and farm accounts in England. It's England rather than the UK because agricultural statistics had evolved, so it was easiest for me to access the English data, but I'd be looking to expand that in the future. I should also say at this point that I'm very aware that definitions are likely to differ between these statistics collection agencies, and I guess that's one of the reasons I'm asking for kind of collaborators. I think we need to bear that in mind, and ideally we'd look to kind of address that. But yeah, take these as kind of illustrative for the time being. So just a note for everything that follows, low fixed cost shares suggests an industry is closer to constant returns to scale and perfect competition, and that varieties are more homogeneous, and higher fixed cost shares suggests the reverse. So for all farms, I'll start with, these are the fixed cost shares from the aggregate data. I think the first thing to note is that in the EU and England, there's a significant difference between the gross and the net measurement. That's unsurprising, I think, given what we know about payments, and that it's much smaller, that gap in the USA. I put there just for illustration on this slide, the GTAP equivalent fixed cost shares for a couple of the heavy manufacturing sectors. The other thing to note, which I don't think is necessarily intuitive, is the ordering by country. Now, with the caveat about the definitions that I've just said, so shouldn't put too much weight on this. It's curious that this aggregate data would suggest that farms in England, the evidence is stronger for increasing returns to scale, whereas if we take the net measure, that's much less the case in the EU, and the USA is somewhere in between the two. Looking at a couple of specific farm types, so starting with cereals, often cereals are reasonably close to the national averages, but there's a huge difference here between gross and net in the EU and England, as cereals receive a lot of payments. The other interesting thing to note, I guess, here is the difference between wheat and corn in the USA. So if we were to base our GTAP HET parameters on these estimates, that would have quite a material impact on the modelling and on the results, because what you're essentially saying is that the US wheat sector is relatively close to constant returns to scale, whereas US corn is much further away, and I think that would materially affect your results. I wanted to look quickly at fruit and veg, because I think this one's more intuitive. So we see here that in England and the EU, at least, horticulture is showing some of the strongest evidence of constant returns to scale. And I think given that this is also a measure of kind of product variety, that makes sense. This is a relatively broad category. There's obviously quite a lot of difference within this commodity. So we'd expect a higher level of product heterogeneity, I think. And then finally, livestock, or grazing livestock, I should say. So this is really interesting because here we see the strongest evidence of possible decreasing returns to scale. So within the EU as a whole, we've got negative net fixed costs. So that means the value of the subsidies is on average greater than the value of the fixed costs, which is a kind of prima facie case for decreasing returns to scale. But it's striking also that even in England and the US, where you don't see that, both of the closest farm types to constant returns to scale are in these grazing livestock sectors. So dairy in the US and less favoured area grazing livestock in England. So moving on from fixed costs to the estimating constant elasticity of substitution, essentially it's you derive it as 1 over the fixed cost share. That derivation is in the GTAP paper, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it here. But remember now that we've kind of reversed it. So a high sigma suggests more homogeneous goods and closer to constant returns to scale. Apologies if this is a bit small. I wanted to show them all in one. So the first thing to note is that the maths fails when you have negative fixed cost shares. So I've put in kind of illustrative high, notional high elasticities in the livestock sectors in the EU that had those negative fixed cost shares. Also, olives falls into that category. And then you see it's quite stark, particularly in England, that the grazing livestock in less favoured areas is significantly higher than the rest of the sectors. And that, as you see, dairy is that bit higher in the US than the other sectors, with corn at the other end. More variety in the EU, I would say, than either of the other countries. So the next variable is the markup, which is essentially the price over variable cost. And that's derived as sigma over sigma minus 1. And so, you know, the pattern is unsurprisingly kind of mirrored here. But I think what's striking is that initially I thought these markups are ridiculously high because I interact a bit with farmers in my day job, and I think if you showed this to any farmers, they'd say that's ridiculously high. But actually, if you look at the aggregate data on kind of total outputs and total costs, it begins to look a bit more plausible, and I was encouraged by that, though it's striking how much higher they are in England than in the EU and the USA. So the final variable we're going to derive is the shape parameter for the productivity distribution. Now, we don't have an exact derivation for this. We just have a rule that it has to be greater than sigma minus 1. So I've kind of applied the minimum value here, so kind of sigma minus 0.99 to show what that would imply for the productivity distribution. And I've just put in the extremes from each region. So to avoid crowding the diagram, basically all other sectors would be between these extremes. So what we've got here is a productivity index along the x-axis with a kind of cutoff point, which is the minimum productivity level. And anything to the left of that leaves the industry. In theory, as I say, sometimes subsidies can complicate that picture. And then as you move to the right, productivity increases and the distribution comes down. So what we see is in the EU, cereals and oilseeds, in England, less favoured area, grazing livestock, and in the USA, dairy, have this high proportion of relatively low productivity farms, which are only just over the cutoff point, and then virtually no farms at the kind of higher productivity levels. Whereas at the other extreme, wine in the EU, corn in the USA, and horticulture in England have quite low numbers of low productivity farms, and then noticeable kind of slightly higher proportions of high productivity farms. And I was encouraged. I think the wine result in the EU and the horticulture result in England are intuitive on that score. I'm less certain about corn in the USA, but I'll admit I know very little about the corn industry in the USA, so I'd be interested to hear thoughts on that. So a word of caution. I'm trying to use a number of different approaches to kind of build out this picture. The approach I've just outlined is one, but in the meantime, I've been working with statistics colleagues to look at the farm level data for England, and this is what this is. It's kind of over a number of years. Ed, it says you're trying to annotate my shared content, so I'm gonna allow it, but be careful. So what this suggests, this is kind of cost against output, and basically the strong linearity suggests cost rise almost directly in proportion to output, which is kind of suggestive of constant returns to scale. So I think we can put that together with the evidence we've already seen, and at least say that the evidence we've already seen could be kind of high-end estimates of whether increasing returns to scale exist or not, and kind of a maximum level, and maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. So just, I think, to summarize, just going to recap on each of those variables. So the fixed cost shares come from the data. And I think based on that last slide, we can take those as high-end estimates, a kind of starting point. But we suspect the truth might not be that high. So industries could be closer to constant returns to scale than those suggest. Following on from that, the elasticities of substitution are likely to be a low-end estimate. So varieties could actually be more homogeneous than those results suggest. The industry markup then, it follows is a high-end estimate, so profits could be lower than the results suggest. And then the shape parameter, as well as for those reasons above, also has this thing that it's kind of the minimum that it could be. So that's kind of for two reasons a low-end estimate. So that means there could actually be fewer high productivity firms than the results suggest. So the results are not entirely satisfying in that we haven't answered the question. But I think it's a starting point. And I guess I'd be really keen to hear whether you think we're kind of on the right track, suggestions for where to go next, certainly offers of engagement and collaboration, as well as any questions you might have. And then I think that's me done. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike, for that very nice presentation. So already, wow. Okay, so from Tom, we have quite some comments. And Tom, would you like to go ahead and ask this directly?
Sure, just a few thoughts, Mike. I mean, it's great to see you digging into the survey data. I think that's great. That's the great thing about the Smelitz model. It gets you thinking about firms. It gets you looking into survey data. That raises the question in these surveys: what is actually in fixed costs? Are these really fixed? Over what time frame? Is it mostly capital and and real estate? So the composition could play a role, obviously. The other thing is that you're making this strong link to the love of variety, the elasticity of substitution, and that really relies on this idea, say the Krugman or really Atkinson, the Dixit-Stiglitz idea that these fixed costs are being expended in order to differentiate another variety. And it seems to me a lot of the large commercial farms, they're just producing, they're just producing corn and they're selling it. The fixed costs, there's a different story behind the fixed costs, perhaps, and that it's maybe more of these kind of local farm to market operations that might be differentiating their products. But is this really an industry where product differentiation is the key driver behind the fixed costs? So just pushing you to think more about the fixed costs and what's in there and what's motivating.
Thanks. Yeah. I think those are really interesting questions. So on the kind of what's included, I mean, absolutely. And I think that's my goal is to, as I say, kind of take a kind of multiplicity of approaches. So this is kind of taking the survey data at face value, kind of the definitions it uses for itself. And that warrants further digging into. But then also the observations about, well, are those costs actually fixed? They claim to be fixed. Are they actually fixed, or do they actually vary with output as well? And I think that's why I was nervous about adding that slide at the end, because it potentially kind of calls into question. But I think it's an important part of the picture, because it suggests that, well, we should be skeptical about whether those results are actually fixed. So yes, I think further approaches are needed to complement the initial work. I guess on the product variety point, I think it's really interesting, and maybe other presenters might have something in relation to this in their presentations. I don't know, but it feels like I kind of want to be able to say something about returns to scale without necessarily being linked to product variety. And I'm not kind of well informed enough to say, how you go about having one without the other. But I feel like challenging the product variety assumption, which I think is open to challenge, isn't necessarily quite the same thing as challenging the kind of returns to scale questions, if that makes sense.
We have a couple more minutes for questions. So does anyone else sign up?
Yeah. Thanks so much for the great presentation, Mike. The results are very interesting, and it's always a challenge to try and get some parameters and fixed cost shares for the agricultural sector, of course. I will talk a little bit in my presentation about getting some farm heterogeneity consistent parameter estimation using power laws, but we also get data for manufacturing sectors, so that's how we impute elasticity values to talk about the level variety effect there. But if you could get some farm size and some sort of productivity proxy, then it is possible to maybe do some sensitivity analysis with different alternative ways of estimating these parameters and imputing parameters. That may give you some idea about level variety, to something to compare. Are you exploring alternative ways to estimate, or in the going forward with the paper?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. And I think one of the good things about working in agriculture is that data is more likely to be available. We do actually have certainly size distributions and a few measures of productivity distributions as well. I mean, you have to be very careful in terms of sensitivities, but in terms of kind of grouped, percentiles or whatnot. Yeah, I think that's certainly a rich area of work going forwards.
I'd be happy to touch base on that. I'm still working on the estimation for manufacturing, and it'd be great to get some collaborative work on agriculture too.
Great. Yeah, definitely.
So if we have any more questions, we have maybe a little time for one final question, if anyone has questions. If not, I can just ask a small question. So I think this sort of goes along though with Zainab's question a bit, because I was curious why you chose sort of this method of estimating the other variables. So as you mentioned, and Zainab was just talking, it's different than the sort of standard method and Cole and co-authors. So why did you choose this method?
I think just because I wanted to use the data that was available, and my starting point on returns to scale was kind of the cost to, well, fixed cost to total cost relationship, and kind of bringing in output as well. That seemed initially to me, I mean, I guess it was probably partly because of my priors, I guess you could call them. I kind of spend more time doing kind of fairly back of the envelope data analysis than I do reading academic papers. So I was more kind of familiar with the data and what we might be able to do with that than with the kind of standard methods that were being applied. So it was probably just a function of that. But like I say, I'm keen to kind of take a rounded approach and apply a few different methods and kind of see what we can learn.
Okay, very good. We still have a couple more minutes, so if there's any more questions, and if not, then we can also start with the next presenter. Okay, so I think that's all the questions so far. So thank you again, Mike, for a very interesting presentation, and especially looking specifically at agriculture. I think there's a lot more work to continue. So very nice. And now Marino Sigas is going to present his report.
Thank you, Kathleen. So this is, I realize that the title is might be meaning different things, but I want to stick with this title because that's my main interest, but you'll see where I'm going here. So what I want to do here is look at the productivity effects of US trade agreements from 1984 to 2016 and relate that to the modeling of non-tariff measures. So I will show you scenarios that I ran with the standard GTAP model and the GTAP heterogeneity model. So I'm new doing work with the GTAP heterogeneity model. I took Zainab's course last fall and it was great. I enjoyed it very much. So in the GTAP heterogeneity model, we decide what sectors are monopolistically competitive, and from that we get scale effects and variety effects. Now, the heterogeneity, firm heterogeneity, is influenced by fixed costs. Firms face fixed costs when they want to enter a sector and produce, and then more fixed costs when they want to sell their product to specific markets. As a result of that, because the firms are heterogeneous regarding productivities, we obtain productivity effects. So that's my link here between the productivity effects of US free trade agreements and the modeling of NTMs. Now, when the first time we heard about GTAP HET, we thought it's great to get the scale effects and the variety effects, but it's even more greater that perhaps we can look at effects, model NTM changes much better in the GTAP HET model. And the idea is that import tariffs are more like variable trade costs, but many NTMs look like they are more fixed trading costs. So GTAP HET then, we thought, it provides a natural way of modeling changes in NTMs. So I will show you simulated effects from a small data set. I have 7 sectors: crops, livestock, mining, 2 manufacturing sectors, services, which we think are significantly affected by trade, and all other services. And the economies are the United States, Canada, Mexico, other countries with US FTAs, so Chile, Korea, etc., are lumped in that aggregate region, and the rest of the world. Now, I want to keep it small because I don't know how far I can go with it. I hope I can expand the sectoral and the economic average later on. So that's the GTAP data set. When I go to GTAP head, I decide that the 2 manufacturing sectors, light manufacturing and heavy manufacturing, are going to be modeled as monopolistically competitive sectors. The remaining sectors will be modeled as perfectly competitive. So periodically, the USITC is required to do an analysis of US trade policies, especially as they relate to free trade agreements. The table you are looking here is from a report in 2016. And for that report, what we did an econometric analysis of all the agreements from the time period that described 84 to 2016. Now, the econometric work is inspired by this reference you see at the bottom of the slide. Bayer and Bergstrand: do free trade agreements actually increase members' international trade? It's an econometric gravity econometric model of trade flows. And when one does that, can obtain the impact of trade policies or free trade agreements on trade costs. And what the table shows is that the estimated effect of US FTAs on tariffs and NTMs. The econometric work estimates reduction in total trade costs. I'm thinking about it as tariffs and NTMs. Now, the table is using the method in Bayer and Bergstrand. We used GTAP trade data to do the estimation in the 2016 report. So because of the data we used and the time we had available, the only differentiation in these effects on trade costs was by sector. So the United States and all trade partners experienced a 4.9% increase in the cost of trading in light manufacturing. So the cost reductions are symmetric and they apply to everyone. With more data, one can start differentiating by particular agreements, exporters, importers, etc. So this is my starting point. That I have these estimates. They are trade cost reductions. They include tariffs and NTMs. And what I will do first, I will turn it around and think what a hypothetical absence of the US FTAs would do to trade costs using the estimated effects of cost reductions. And that's the second column in this table now. So from the negative 4.9% reduction in trade costs, I can say that if all US FTAs were absent, trade costs for light manufacturing would increase by 5.15%. And again, at this point, it's tariffs and NTMs that I'm thinking about. Now, moving forward then, now I am going to make the assumption that the tariff contribution and the NTM contribution is going to be equal. One can assume different things, but we are at a particular year, let's say 2016, and we want to simulate the absence of US FTAs. There are still some small tariffs and some NTMs in place for these trade partners. I don't think it's very important how much is the tariff part or the NTM part. But so I'm going to assume they are split. It's very difficult to become more specific because at that point you need to think what were the tariffs when these agreements were put in place, and then it becomes a much bigger job. Now, the equal split I'm doing here, for what I want to see, I don't think is important, and you'll see why. Okay, so that's this is the scenario I want to explore. Tariffs will increase, NTMs will increase by the same percentages. So Zeynep was gracious and she shared with us some calibration tools. And this is what I did. This is the first column shows the GTAP Armington elasticity for sourcing of imports by these sectors. And then I need to calibrate parameters for the GTAP head model. Now, mimicking some work that Zeynep had done, I choose the elasticity substitution parameters here in the second column, and the shape parameter in the third column. I didn't estimate anything. I haven't estimated anything at this point. But that's what I chose, and as a result of that, and this is an important part now, at the last column, I obtain fixed cost shares in terms of sales. So these are the fixed costs in percent that exporters occur when they export to different markets. Now, I think this is an important part, and maybe it will come back. Maybe we can discuss this later. But that's what is in the database. So this is my data for 2017 in GTAP head. And the simulation I will do is raise tariffs and raise fixed costs for between the United States and the free trade partners. Okay, now to refresh a little bit your memory, for the standard GTAP simulation, I will use the AMS parameter, and this appears in the demand equation for imports. And in the GTAP head simulation, I will use the AVAFS simulation, and this appears in the demand equation for primary factors for fixed costs. To refresh your memory and to know what I'm doing. Okay, so here I have 3 columns, 3 scenarios, 2 different models different specifications. The first column is the standard GTAP model, and as you see, I have TMS underneath, which means I collapsed the tariff shock and the NTM shock to a tariff shock. Okay, so at this point I assume NTMs are like tariffs; they create revenue. They don't change productivities or they don't introduce any technical change. And you'll see that I obtain an allocative efficiency effect 2.4 billion, 3.2 billion terms of trade, and the total welfare effect is 5.5 billion. They are negative because we are raising trade costs. In the second column, I do what I described earlier. I split the total change in trade costs between TMS and AMS. And now you can see I have losses in productivity for the manufacturing AMS shocks. That's the 14.7 billion. And also from the other sectors, the AMS shocks from the other sectors, 1.8. Now I show you the manufacturing AMS out contribution because it will be treated differently in the third column. Where now for manufacturing, I don't have an AMS shock. I have the AVA FS shock, and that gives me a negative 8.3 welfare shock. If you go all the way down to the total welfare shock is a negative 8.7 billion US dollars. So that was that's how I wrote down that title. What are the productivity effects of US trade agreements and how they depend on the modeling of AMS or of NTMs? What we see here, if you agree with what I have done, we get a much smaller welfare effect, total welfare effect from the GTAP head model than from this middle column, but it is bigger than if we assumed that all trade costs look like a tariff reduction. Okay, now if for a moment you agree with me that everything else in this table, apart from the terms of trade effects, are productivity effects. Maybe they are allocative efficiency effects, maybe they are technical change, maybe they are economies of scale, but everything else are productivity effects. And you do a calculation, I saw at the bottom here. So what I do, I deduct the terms of trade from the total welfare effect. And then that is productivity effects, various productivity effects. We do get a huge productivity effect if we touch AMS. But we now, the standard GTAP approach is very close to what the GTAP head approach might show. Now, I have to tell you that I have been confused many times while I'm doing this. Last week, I wanted to call Zainab to help me out with what I was doing, but I guess theoretical knowledge is no good if you don't do it. So that's where I am at this point. I would appreciate any comments and insights you have.
Okay, thank you very much, Marinos, for your very nice presentation. Do we have any comments? I see there was, yes, okay, so Tom again has some comments. Tom, would you like to ask these comments yourself?
Yeah, this is a really interesting exercise, Marino. So, yeah, I'm just repeating what you've said to make sure I've got it, because I think it's really important. I think to a great extent, people who've been modeling the NTMs have been working through these tech change terms. And you're saying if it's cost increasing, that's going to be grossly misstating the benefits from NTMs. What do you think about NTMs? And are they largely cost increasing? Is that the way they're evidenced?
Okay, now that's a good point. We are doing an update of the 2016 report. We are required to do that right now. The people have, I didn't do the econometric work myself, other people did that. But this time they expanded the econometric analysis, the gravity modeling. Again, they are looking back at US FTAs, and it's differentiated by sector now and trade agreement. And these trade cost reductions are much more significant. And in some cases, they are not reductions, they are cost increases. Now, with this type of work, it's difficult. We are measuring something, but we don't know exactly what it is, right? It's abstract. So I don't know myself. I don't think we can tell. When we get these econometric estimates, usually we go back to people who know what we are talking about, and we try to confirm it. But of course, this is it's important. It needs to be done. But it's difficult work. Now also we have the advantage that we are looking backwards, right? So we can obtain some estimates. Looking forward, it's a different, much more difficult exercise.
Maria, I know Dave Tarr has a question, but it seems to me what's needed is like a deep dive with your industry specialists into a couple of really salient non-NTMs and figuring out what actually happens on the ground. Are they causing the firms to have to increase the cost of getting into the market, or is it something else? Anyway, I agree. You guys have the expertise in-house to really delve into that, I think it's really important. Just underscoring that. I'll turn it over to Dave, I think.
So I'll comment on the same point that Tom was raising. I think it is a very interesting and useful point, and often overlooked, that the agreements on NTMs can be cost increasing. So there are two aspects to this. First of all, we know that NTMs these days primarily focus on our problem of standards and technical regulations. And so, if I would just to give some context to this, in the Eurasian Economic Union, it's a union of 5 countries, including Russia and 4 of its close partners. They're trying to mimic the European Union and harmonize standards, which they think will, reduce non-tariff barriers on the trade amongst each other. And The problem is that they are trying to do it through harmonization, not mutual recognition. And then each of the nations essentially have lobbying from their own producers, because to harmonize, there's an investment cost of adjusting to the new standard if it's not their national one. So each of the negotiators from each of the regions press for their own regulations to be the harmonized standard rather than a partner's one or a common one to avoid the investment costs. If once you achieve that harmonized standard, then the cost of trading is a lot lower. So that's the trade-off, and that's the one we usually model. But I think we often do ignore the investment cost of achieving the harmonized standard.
Thank you, David.
Do you have any further response, Marino, or any comment back?
Well, I mean, as you know, we used to, be very selective, look at regulations and NTMs that we thought we are changing and they were significant, and then model those. I see some benefit to the econometric approach, but as Tom said and as David said, it needs to be validated. Make sure that we know what we are modeling.
Okay, thank you, Marina. And we also have a comment from Lars Nielsen. Lars, if you would like to show up or to...
Thank you. So my question and comment would be on the fact we know that non-tariff barriers and non-tariff measures, they do exist. What we're less sure of, though, is the extent to which free trade agreements actually reduce these. And that's why I think that Marino's findings here and the update that the USITC are going to do, it's really interesting, because it could very well be that you could find an impact of trade in sectors where there are actually no provisions or reductions in NTBs. I mean, so if you would separate, I mean, once you account for the tariff reductions, I would not be surprised if you find additional impact on trade that you cannot really explain, because there will be no provisions in the agreements on NTBs. And I'm saying this from the EU perspective, where, for instance, in services, we most often only bind existing levels of commitments, 5 levels of protection. We don't go beyond. And when we did an ex-post evaluation of the EU-Korea FTA, we did find trade effects that we could not really explain. So it could be an increase of, there's more stuff about it in the media. Operators become more and more aware of what's going on. Maybe the word spreads. Maybe there are some other effects, but I think that's an important point to remember, that there could be effects that go beyond what we actually know. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. Marino, do you have any reflections or any comments back?
Well, I cannot. So this update I'm talking about will come out in a month or so. I cannot talk about it right now, but you see what Lars was saying. The econometric work suggests that trading costs may increase in the face of liberalization, or can find nothing where you expected significant effects. So, yeah.
Okay. And we have another question from Zainab. If you would like to go ahead, Zainab.
Thanks. Thanks, Marinos, for the great presentation. And I just have a quick question about the welfare results, about the technical efficiency. So I saw in the table the technical shifter effects, the NTM shock, the AMS shock, and all that. But do you have any idea about what happened to the average industry productivity and how it affects welfare? Have you maybe? I'm not sure if it was included in the table. I didn't see it. So if you get a chance, maybe we can talk about that later too.
Yeah. Well, so I'm focusing on the fixed cost part of it, and what I'm seeing is that the tariff changes, the TMS shock, is changing the fixed cost contribution much more than the fixed cost shock. And it's what you see is that fixed costs, we increase fixed costs because we remove the FTAs, but the fixed cost contribution was positive in terms of welfare. And I think that's happening because exports decline. I haven't, as I said, I got confused many times and I thought I didn't know what I was doing. And I'm not sure that I know what I'm doing. So yeah, I plan to work more on this. You know, I'm not going to do any econometric estimation or anything, but maybe change the calibration of the GTAP head model and see, you know, how the modeling of NTMs affects the productivity effects.
Okay, thank you, Zeynep and Marina. Tom, did you want to make this further comment that you had?
Just wanted to probe David a bit further. It seems to me, am I correct, Dave, in interpreting your suggestion as potentially two shocks? On the one hand, your fixed costs increase because you've got to meet this new standard, but once you've adopted the common standard, your trading costs decrease. That would be an interesting combo shock. Would that reflect some of your thinking, David?
Yeah, it's definitely would be a way to move forward on that. I mean, there's a question of it's a once and for all investment cost to meet the standard, and then you have permanent lower cost of trading. It's a question of how you spread that fixed cost out. That once you know, if you have a comparative static model, you just put it in that one period. There's no issue that if you're dealing a dynamic model, then you might want to prove it out somehow on the fixed cost. But anyway, yeah, but I agree with you that that would be the logical way to proceed.
Okay, and I think we're right on time now. So if there's any further comments, we could take one quick one. Are there any further comments? Or Marino, I don't know if you wanted to respond to this final discussion also.
No, I don't know how. I mean, it looks, it's happening. I don't know how to do that. I need to talk with Zeynep. But yeah, it's good thinking. I don't know how to do that. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Marino, and also thank you to everyone who had very insightful comments. And now, Zeynep, if you would like to go ahead and share your slides, and you can go ahead and also start.
Is it up? Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our session. I've been working on the GTAP model for a while now, and we are thinking about how to further develop it and deploy it. And today I'll talk a little bit about some of the updates that we're thinking and what we have applied by through a hypothetical policy example with the recently signed Turkey-UK FTA. So I'll briefly do an introduction on our motivation and an overview of the GTAP model and what we are introducing to move towards the GTAP version 2.0, if you will. So basically, what I'm going to share with you today is a change in the characterization of fixed costs, which we've been talking a lot today. And in the original GTAP model, the fixed costs are assumed to be only composed of value-added inputs. And today I will introduce intermediate inputs into this fixed cost composition and talk about the effects a little bit. And then I will talk about the data and parameterization needs of the model and share with you how we estimate and impute, how do we estimate the shape parameter of productivity dispersion and impute the elasticity of substitution using Pareto distribution, which is a power law. And then I will move on to the Turkey-UK FTA example and with a hypothetical policy, a cut in regulatory costs and fixed export costs. I'll also show sensitivity checks to parameters and then we'll conclude. Turkey and UK trading relationships have been governed by the EU-Turkey Customs Union since Turkey has been a member since '95 in the pre-Brexit era. So in the post-Brexit era, there have been talks about once Brexit occurs, what's going to happen to these relationships, because the bilateral volume of trade between the two states is around $16 billion. And Turkey mostly exports motor vehicles and parts sectors, retail and textiles, automotive parts, and imports from UK, again, automotive parts, engines, diesel engines, steel and iron. And if the trading relationships trading relationships are broken due to Brexit, then there will be approximately 75% of Turkish exports to UK would be subject to tariffs, which will be a huge loss to Turkey. So there, the relationship smoothly translated into a post-Brexit FTA between Turkey and UK, which was signed on January 1st, 2021, which was the first FTA that UK signed after Brexit. And so there are many provisions, and the idea was to maintain the status quo with this FTA, but it's also leaving room for some improvements and about customs and trade facilitation, regulatory costs. So that is what I'm going to focus on today. I will focus on lowering regulatory costs in motor vehicles and parts sector of Turkey and the UK. Those costs are mainly the biggest challenge for new firms and even existing firms to enter into export markets and new firms to stay in the industry. And mostly the small firms are hit by those regulatory costs because larger firms could spread their fixed costs over a larger share sales, but small firms cannot survive. And the firm heterogeneity model is a great tool to explore this effect as it allows for firm participation in markets. And again, as I said, I will explore the effect of change in the characterization of fixed costs by including intermediate inputs. We assumed fixed costs as value added only before. Those are labor and capital, accountants, administrative work, paperwork, labor and capital that is used in, but we could also think of research and development efforts, and intermediate inputs are used in these in covering these costs too. So it's just a quick overview of the GTAP model. So in the standard GTAP model, we have perfect competition, identical firms and varieties, factor productivity is exogenous, and trade policies lead to changes in trade volumes of existing varieties in the market. But in the GTAP model, we introduce consumers gaining utility from a variety of unique varieties. Firms have scale economies in sales. There's intermediate input trade, of course, additional welfare effects because of market reallocation of firms within the industry. We have fixed costs, firm entry and exit in markets due to productivity threshold differences, and overall a change in industry productivity due to market reallocation effects. And we have policy instruments, NTMs, as Marina also talked about, specifically aimed to shock fixed costs. So let me just pull this up real quick. So in the standard GTAP model, we have production composed of value-added and intermediate inputs, which has the Armington specification. In the GTAP model, as I said, we differentiate between value-added used in variable production and used in covering fixed costs. And intermediate inputs are sourced from region, and we break the imports on domestic distinction in the differentiated sector, sort of the heterogeneous or monopolistic, the competitive sector. And we keep the Armington assumption in the non-differentiated, perfectly competitive sector. Now in GTAP version 2.0, we keep this section where we use part of value-added in variable production, and part of value-added would be go into the fixed costs, which is distinguished to partition into fixed setup costs to enter an industry, and fixed trading costs to be able to enter into domestic and export markets. But on top of that, we're now adding partitioning intermediate inputs into a variable portion and a fixed portion. So, of course, in intermediate inputs, we have monopolistically competitive inputs going into covering fixed costs, and perfectly competitive non-differentiated goods going into covering fixed costs. So this is also going to come up in market clearing equations. We need to be careful about that, because all of these intermediate input sales are the demand side, and we need to make sure that it is cleared in the market, the supply side. So production will only be using the variable intermediate inputs in market clearing too. So the fixed inputs will have a separate market clearing condition. There's also some changes in the fixed cost calibration. So previously, the fixed trading costs, for example, were calibrated based on sales, and some of these variable costs were residuals, calculated as residuals. And there were some issues that were related to that. For example, fixed costs are 1 over sigma times the total cost. VOA is the total cost. And if the elasticity of substitution is really small, this would be really high, and then the variable cost would be negative value flows. And in those cases, we were characterizing the market with really low sigma values, with not really from heterogeneity. But in this new calibration, we are making everything a share of the total cost, fixed setup cost, fixed trading costs, and eliminating the residuals. So the only requirement that we really need to fulfill is the mathematical constraint that shape parameter of productivity distribution needs to be greater than sigma minus 1. And we also changed the demand equations for the intermediate inputs. So QFMCV is our demand for intermediate input of monopolistic, the competitive intermediate input, sourced from a specific region S, and demanded in region R to use in the variable the production. So it's the variable intermediate input. And it is the standard Stiglitz variety induced demand equation. So there is an expansion effect, QF, and there is a variety effect. More varieties coming from a specific source is increasing the demand at the utility of the consumer, the demand for of firms for variable intermediate inputs. And then there is a substitution effect, which uses the variable index price for intermediate inputs. And then we have a fixed cost component of intermediate input demand. This time we have a new fixed cost shifter, the technical change shifter in the model. So this is basically an efficiency parameter, efficiency variable to mimic fixed cost shocks that would induce changes in intermediate input demand and price too. And we have, instead of an expansion effect, we only have the number of potential firms entering into this demand equation for fixed costs for intermediate inputs, because these fixed cost demand does not change with the volume of production. It only changes by market participation of firms. So if there are more potential firms in the market, then they will require more intermediate inputs to cover those fixed costs. And then we have a price, the substitution effect. I mean, there could be an argument here that makes that we should assume the NTF assumption here, because we only require fixed proportions of specific inputs, but that's also the modeler's choice to give sigma a 0 value if you think Leontief makes more sense. I assumed a CES form for it for the time being. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the parameters of the model before going into the simulation exercise. So we are assuming productivity distribution to follow a Pareto distribution, as is applied in commonly in the literature. There is the argument of Pareto distribution to form a poor fit in the left tail of expert distribution. And there's an argument that empirical relevance may not apply to small firms in those cases, since there may be a minimum size threshold for power laws to provide a good fit in the tail. And we take those assumptions into account in separate work that we did with Saad Ahmed from USITC. And despite the empirical arguments about the tail, we use Pareto distribution. We assume that because it's synaptically tractable in CG models. It has a good performance on the right tail if you estimate a lower bound for a good fit, and there is this a good characteristic that if firm productivity is Pareto, which is a power law, firm size is also Pareto, which gives us a good way to estimate shape parameters of firm productivity and firm size, which is linked to give us an imputed value of sigma elasticity values. So I'm going to show you in a little bit of what I mean. So we estimate shape and elasticity values for GTAP versions 10 manufacturing sectors, and following Closet, Shalizi, and Newman's work, we first estimate a minimum size threshold, a lower bound before we fit Pareto law. So what I mean is, in step 1, we estimate a lower bound parameter. We use a Kolmogorov-Smirnov statistic, which means that we're minimizing the distance between an empirical distribution and the model distribution, which gives us X-min hat, the lower threshold for to fit the Pareto law. And then using this X-min hat, we estimate Pareto law parameter using a maximum likelihood estimator, which is alpha hat. So alpha hat is the firm size shape parameter, and gamma hat is what we're after, which is the shape parameter of productivity distribution. And in the final state, we impute elasticity of substitution via this relationship. The size, the shape parameter of the size distribution is linked to the shape parameter of productivity distribution and elasticity of substitution, where we impute the sigma values. And we use Orbis data for the annual firm-level financial data for this estimation. It uses a NACE classification of revision 2. And we also use GTAP version 10. We fit it to GTAP version 10 sectoral definition, which has 19 manufacturing sectors. We're only doing this for the manufacturing sectors. We don't have data for other sectors for now. And GTAP version 10 provides mapping to ISAC revision 4. So we start with NACE revision 2, map it to ISAC revision 4, and then map it to GTAP. And these are the shape and elasticity values in the GTAP manufacturing sectors. So the first bars, they show the shape parameter values for firm size, alpha, and firm productivity, gamma. So for firm size, we use two proxies, operating revenue and number of employees. And for firm productivity, we use labor productivity and index TFP as proxies. And we don't see a lot of, productivity, we see productivity is less heterogeneous than firm size within the GTAP manufacturing sectors. And we see that the mathematical constraint is satisfied because alphas are greater than 1s. And then we use these values to impute elasticity. And since we have two proxies for firm size and two proxies for productivity, we have 4 different alternatives of elasticity values. So in this study, though, I'm going to use operating revenue as firm size and labor productivity for firm productivity. And then the elasticity values will be this column. So in the policy experiment, we use GTAP version 10 database, which we source to industry source specific bilateral. We translate it to industry source specific bilateral trade data for sourcing of intermediate inputs. We have 7 sectors, which I assume motor vehicles and parts, light manufacturing and heavy manufacturing at heterogeneous. There are 7 sectors: Turkey, UK, US, China, Russia, European Union, and the rest of the world. And my focus is on the motor vehicles and parts sector. And the assumption is a 5% cut in fixed setup costs of motor vehicles and parts in Turkey and the UK. So this is lowering costs to enter into the industry. And then a fixed 5% cut in fixed export costs of bilateral sales of motor vehicles and parts between Turkey and the UK. So this is to cut costs to enter into, for UK firms to enter into Turkish market and for Turkish firms to enter into the UK market. So two different sets of shocks there. So this is basically working via saving resources. Okay. So when we shock these fixed cost shifters, we're actually assuming that there is less inputs required to cover the fixed costs. And we used to have the AVAFE fixed cost shifter. So this is assuming value-added requirements are less. Now there are less requirements for fixed costs. And this AFFE is saying that there is less requirement for intermediate inputs and fixed costs. So to quickly go over the results. So this left-hand side gives the % change in production and trade in UK, Turkey, and EU. So we see that this fixed cost shock increases production in motor vehicles and parts sector of UK and Turkey and hurts European Union motor vehicles and parts production. We see that domestic sales increase, but export sales increase more for UK and Turkey, which actually drives this output increase. And when we look at the producer prices, we see that they're going down for all, while input price is also going down, but they're smaller than the producer price decline. And this, and in fact, in EU, we have a higher input price. And why is the producer price going down more than the input price is explained by these endogenous productivity changes that we pick up in the firm heterogeneity model. So the market share reallocations of more productive firms and dropping off less productive firms from the market actually increases the productivity of the motor vehicles and parts sector, and further reducing the producer price. And these show the productivity threshold of and firm participation in the three regions in the motor vehicles and parts sector. So we see that the domestic productivity thresholds are increasing in both Turkey and UK, and we're still seeing more firms entering. These are potential firms that may not actually produce in the market. And between UK and Turkey, we see the thresholds are decreasing and there are more firms entering because this is less costly to export into UK and export into Turkey now. And the opposite happens for Europe. So it's firm numbers are decreasing there. And so now we can pick up some intensive and extensive margins of factor demand, where we can see that what happens to factor demand because of the expansion in the market, and what happens to it because of the fixed cost changes. We can partition that for value-added and also for intermediate inputs, which I want to spend just a little bit of time here. I know I'm over time. So this is demand for own demand, some motor vehicles and parts demand in the motor vehicles and parts sector of Turkey, UK, and Europe. So we see that the variable portion is increasing for example, for Turkey. So these are these are imports into Turkey. So since the sector is expanding, they're requiring more intermediate inputs, but because there are more firms exporting, there is higher demand for the fixed portion of intermediate inputs too. And sometimes we see the reverse happening. Even though the variable portion is increasing, the fixed portion is actually decreasing because we are picking up the extensive margin effects there for intermediate inputs. And lastly, I want to show you a sensitivity analysis with the different elasticity values. We don't see a lot of difference between those 4 different elasticity values for Turkey and Europe. There's a little bit of difference for UK when we use a number of employees for firm size proxy. And I really haven't, I'm still working on why that happened. I mean, it's not too much of a difference, but what happens with firm size proxy that gives us this different value. So that's pretty much what I'd like to share today. So characterization of fixed costs is important in analyzing fixed costs and NTMs. And certainly with introduction of intermediate inputs, we pick up more effects. And what we would like to further do with GTAP is exploring this side of fixed export costs and intermediate inputs. There's a lot of feedback on producer price. Also, we would like to update that producer price to be directly linked to bilateral productivity thresholds, and some modeling and database changes to be compatible with GTAP version 7 and GTAP MRAD database. So thanks for listening. This is, sorry for going over time. This is.
You're perfectly on time, Zeynep.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah. So we're right on schedule. So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Are there any comments or questions? And if not, I'll have a couple. But let's see. Even if you haven't written it yet, if anyone wants to just show up and ask a question. Okay, so for the time being, I'll start with my questions, and then maybe that will spur some other people also. Or Tom, do you have a question? Or a comment?
Yeah. I was just starting to type it in, but it seems like your main motivation for incorporating variable inputs and fixed costs is kind of mechanical. You've got this residual that's causing problems for you. So you want to push some variable costs, variable inputs into the fixed component. I mean, what are you thinking about there? I understand the mechanics, the motivation, but I'm just wondering whether you can make a practical case for including variable inputs, or the intermediate inputs. I misspoke. Intermediate inputs into the fixed cost. I'm sorry, I was garbling that up a little bit, but you highlighted the inclusion of intermediates in the fixed cost component as an advance, and it seemed like that was mainly for mechanical reasons. Is that right?
So yes, there's a mechanical aspect of it that is all helping with. Can you hear me? Oh, okay, good. I thought it was frozen. So there's a mechanical aspect of it to really address these issues that is coming up with variable costs. But there is also the aspect of being able to, in different sectors, we can explore further to see if the intermediate inputs are really part of fixed costs, or is it only value added? So I wanted to have that ability in the model so that we can explore these NTMs, these fixed costs, regulatory costs further. That wasn't there before. I mean, I'm happy with assuming value added to be only fixed cost to be only value added, but I wanted the ability to have it there because we're expanding the model. We are exploring different FTAs, we're exploring different sectors, and there could be the case to be made in specific sectors that part of intermediate inputs is actually used. I hope to have services in there too, because I think a part of fixed costs are services too, but there's not much data there to estimate any parameters.
If I can actually just add on to that, I also know that Mike has a question, but just real quickly, because my first question was related to Tom's. So is it true then, so it's still sort of a theoretical hypothesis in a sense, but is there empirical work on this at all? And then I was wondering also, how do you sort of estimate the partition between intermediates now? So you have the standard intermediates, but then you have the intermediates that are now part of the fixed costs. So how do you decide what is that partition? And then also I was wondering sort of how these results then compare. I guess, did you do like a sensitivity analysis compared with the standard GTAP? So how do your results compare?
Yes, thanks, Caitlin. So the comparative analysis, I will be doing that, but I wanted to also incorporate some other features into the model to show GTAP version 1 versus GTAP version 2. And for fixed cost partitioning, I'm using the parameters to split between fixed costs, a variable portion, and the fixed portion. And I'm also using the value added, how much value added was partitioned into fixed costs and variable costs also translates to intermediate inputs too. And you had another question about empirical analysis. Do you mean empirical analysis about what are fixed costs and any estimations on fixed costs?
Yeah. Especially in relation to intermediates. So kind of building off. Yeah.
I'm still working on that front because I haven't seen many. I had some results on, I had some empirical results and surveys on regulatory costs in the US and some in Europe, but not much really on intermediate inputs have been done so far. But it'd be good to relate that to the model.
Okay, thank you, Zainab. And now let's go ahead with Mike's question. Mike, would you like to show up and ask your question directly?
Thanks. Yeah, I was just wondering about model stability. I know that is sometimes an issue with heterogeneous fair models, and whether both, I guess, like relative to previous versions of GTAP, is it noticeably better? Or yeah, how's that going?
I think it's better. So I don't encounter the stability issues we encounter with GTAP version 1. And it's more supportive of the empirical work too. I mean, the elasticity and shape parameter values are different, smaller than the other calibration that we did earlier on. And with the different calibration of fixed costs, they are not really causing those stability issues as before. So.
Okay, do we have any other questions? If you also want to just show up, you could ask your question directly. You don't have to type it in the chat. Okay, if we don't, I have another question, Zainab. So I wanted to ask you a bit about how you decided to model the FTA. So you mentioned that you are actually shocking both setup costs and export costs. So I was wondering what your decision-making process was, because for me, I was thinking that it would be the export costs, but I was wondering why you also decided to include the setup costs.
Yeah, so many of the firms that are trying to enter the industry are really hurt by the initial regulatory costs that they have to face. These upfront investment costs, research and development costs. So those are the firms that we also want to capture in the model, and we want to capture in with the FTA, whether there are more firms encouraged to enter or not with these costs. So the bilateral export costs are one part of the issue, but setup costs are much higher actually.
Are there any other questions? We have actually, maybe now we can just move on actually, because I think we're exactly on time, unless we have any other questions. No? Okay, so David, you can go ahead and share your slides.
Okay. Do you see my?
We don't see your slides, and now we see your slides. And now we don't.
No, you do.
Now we do.
Okay.
We see it now.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Caitlin. It's a real pleasure to be here and be virtually interact with some of my friends again. It'd be nice to be in person, but this is certainly better than not having a conference. So I'm happy to be here. So this is a paper jointly with Ed Ballesteri of the University of Nebraska, and focusing on the mathematics of the generalized versions of the Mellitz, Krugman, and Armington models, where we emphasize with detailed derivation. Okay. So this paper has two objectives. The first is to document the paper that the companion paper that Ed and I have done on the evaluation of the relative welfare gains in Mellitz models compared with Armington and Krugman models. I'll come back to that issue in the second half, or at least the last third of my presentation, elaborating on those issues. And to provide a pedagogical mathematical derivation of these models. It will make it easier to learn the models, especially the heterogeneous firms model of international trade. So, why is it not moving here? Sorry. Okay. So our full policy model extends the Mellitz 2003 paper for heterogeneous firms in multiple dimensions. All of these are extensions. Everything listed in this slide is an extension of Mellitz 2003. Multiple sectors, intermediates, labor leisure choice, heterogeneous firms, heterogeneous regions, multiple primary factors, sector-specific factors, non-zero trade balances, tariff and tariff policies, unilateral trade policies, as well as global. Of course, there are models out there that have done any of this, but relative to the math of the knowledge model, these are extensions. And their claim is that despite its generality, it's going to be easier to learn the heterogeneous firms model with this paper, especially with because we take a pedagogical step-by-step approach to the derivation. The feedback we've received, especially from graduate students who previously had international trade and then got our paper after the course, have said to us, I wish I had had this paper when I was taking my international trade course. So I think this is, so we hope it will be a roadmap for understanding the theory better of multi-sector, multi-region international trade models that must be fitted to data. As far as what literature is out there on the mathematics of the heterogeneous firms model, Stephen Redding has a really nice paper in 2010 and a PowerPoint that goes along with it for his classes that provides a good mathematical explanation of the Mellis 2003 paper. Donaldson also has a really nice PowerPoint for his classes, but we need to extend that model for empirical application along the lines of the earlier slide. The paper by Ballesteri and Rutherford in the Handbook of Computable General Equilibrium Modeling complements this paper, provides the calibration, computer code for a model, but it doesn't go in, it has the equations of the model, but not the derivation. So this paper is the derivation. There's a paper in the journal Global Economic Analysis by Zeynep Balouri and Tom Hertel, which provides mathematics of the generalized heterogeneous firms model and computer code for how to implement it. What I found best, I really enjoyed in that paper was its excellent explanation of the economic intuition for the equations of the heterogeneous firms model. But there's no bilateral selection into export markets in that paper, which is a hallmark of the Mellis approach. And so we addressed that issue in the paper. There's a book by Peter Dixon, Michael Jerry, and Maureen Rimmer in 2018, which is a comprehensive approach to Armington, Krugman, and Mellis models on addressing the mathematics, the computer code and GTAP, calibration issues, and derive some interesting economic theory results of the welfare effects of Mellis models. Regarding the math, we believe our approach adds value, first and foremost because it uses a continuous variable approach. The Dixon et al. Book uses primarily a discrete variable approach. And to read virtually all, I know of no theory literature that uses a discrete approach. If you want to read the discrete theory literature, you need to know the continuous variable approach. So this is part of the reason we use continuous variable approach. I also think it's actually easier, the continuous variable approach. Dixon, Jerry, and Rimmer would dispute that, but I believe part of the reason for the difficulty of the continuous variable approach for some people who attempt to learn it is the lack of step-by-step detailed explanations which we provide. Also, compared to Dixon et al., we provide derivations with intermediates and multiple primary factors of reduction. Their paper doesn't have, uses labor as a single factor of reduction. We include labor-leisure choice in the model with derivations. This is there's only one other paper that includes labor-leisure choice that I know of in heterogeneous firms models. That's the paper by Ballesteri, Hilberry, and Rutherford in 2010. But that was a single sector model and single factor of reduction. So this is in a more generalized framework. And also, there's greater generality of the probability density function in the sense that most of the equations in the firms model are derived as Mellis does with the general probability function. It takes Pareto only at the last step to obtain the bilateral cutoff and the zero profit condition. There's a core set of equations which are common to all three market structures. This was shown by Ballesteri and Rutherford in their handbook of suitable general equilibrium, and is elaborated in considerable detail by the Dixon Jerry Rimmer book. The difference in these common equations is in the interpretation of some of the variables. And I'll give an example of that. So there's we have four tables with four sets of equations, those which are common to all three models. And there's two sets of Armington-specific equations, 5 sets of Krugman-specific equations, and 7 sets of Mellitz-specific equations. The prerequisites are what you would normally have as a graduate student in economics. I don't think there's anything more required than that. So the example we have of common equation is we assume that the cost structure is a linear homogeneous function of all intermediates and all primary factors of reduction. So the unit cost function here is in this primary. Should say that primary factors are always in Cobb-Douglas. And here we have primary factor F and mobile primary factor F. And this is sector-specific factor F. And there's a Cobb-Douglas nest. And then this is intermediate factor with price P in sector J as an input into sector I. So this is the unit cost of inputs, of a composite input in sector I of region R, assuming that that they interact in the CES framework and the intermediates are CES. We allow intermediates to be Cobb-Douglas and different elasticities on the intermediates. Primary factors are always Cobb-Douglas. And then on the interpretation, so if it's an Armington structure, then the price of the intermediate is the Armington aggregate, and if it's monopolistic competition, this is the Dixon-Stiglitz aggregate. And then this follows some discussion we had in the previous session. In our paper, we assume variable and fixed costs all use the same bundle of composite inputs. This follows the approach of many authors in the field, Helpman and Krugman, Casanova, Rodriguez-Clare, Ballesteri and Rutherford, Dixon, et al., both 2018 and 2019. Only 2019. And Marcus and Rutherford and Tarr, 2005. And this makes the math a good bit easier since firms use the composite input. The math is no more complicated than the various theory models that assume labor is the sole factor of production. We just carry around this unit cost of the composite input instead of the wage rate in the math. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the mathematical paper. I'm not going to sort of go through derivation. The proof is the pudding is in the eating, and you have to do that with pencil and paper. But I think you'll find it an easier part. I'm going to talk a bit about the Ballesteri Tarr paper in 2020, which compares the relative welfare costs. This is an issue which became prominent by the paper of Arkalakis, Casanova, and Rodriguez-Clare, who said welfare effects are equal in 3 models, provided you adjust trade responses in the 3 models to be consistent with the gravity estimate. The gravity is the hallmark, is the workhorse model of empirical trade, and all models, trade responses in all models should be consistent with gravity. That was the argument of their argument, and then even more strongly by Casanova and Rodriguez-Clare. Dixon and all in his paper, their book also adopted that point of view. And so to be consistent with that approach, we do that in this paper as well. We hold trade responses equal in these 3 models. We take the trade response from the Mellitz model, and then we adjust elasticities in the Krugman and Mellitz models to be consistent. I'm sorry, in the Krugman and Armington models to be consistent with the trade response in the Melitz model. In multi-country models, multi-sector models, we must adjust. We have to use alternate calibration strategies because you can't hold trade responses in all regions equal. So we have recalibration strategies that we show results are robust to any of these calibration strategies. So if we come to some of the key results, define M as the global change in welfare with respect to a global change in trade costs. That's going to be our uppercase M. And similarly for K and A in the Krugman and Armington model. So this is our summary table in the paper. We have 18 model variants, as I mentioned. And I'll just go through very quickly what these model variants are. We start with iceberg trade cost changes, global ones, in a one-sector model. This is the core Archilochus Costano Rodriguez-Clare model, and where welfare effects are the same across the three structures. And we add labor leisure choice and intermediate good, both intermediate and labor choice, all in the one-sector model. And then we go to different intermediate structures. We go to different assumptions on primary factors, a single factor, and multiple factors, sector-specific factor with labor leisure choice. Then we go to, those are in four-sector models. Then we go to a nine-sector model with four perfectly competitive sectors and five monopolistically competitive sectors, and monopolistic competition models. And we look at first iceberg changes in trade costs and then tariff changes. We consider with and without labor leisure choice, with and without initial uniform tariffs. And then finally, we look at unilateral increases in all tariffs in all 10 regions of the model to 25%. So this is the three columns with trade responses equalized. And this is the Armington result where we index the Armington welfare effect at a result at 1. And then the Krugman overall, we index, this is the ratio of the Krugman to Armington welfare gain. And so once we get out of this stylized one-sector model, we start to get differences between Krugman and Melitz. Again, we're holding trade responses equal, consistent with structural gravity in all of these cases. And in some cases, we get gains of almost 5 times the gain of the Armington model in the Melitz model. So to summarize briefly, we, in all cases, we're beyond the stylized model of Archilochus Costano Rodriguez-Clare. We get that the Melitz model gives you larger gains than the Krugman model, which gives you larger gains than Armington. And that's and the gains range in this framework here. And this again, this is the global welfare change with respect to a global change in welfare costs. We find that the Krugman model captures between 76 and 95% of the gains above Armington that are captured by the Melitz model. This means that the Krugman model is much closer to the Melitz model than it is to the Armington model. And they suggest that the variety effect is quantitatively more important than the selection effect in differentiating the monopolistic competition models from Armington. Because the Krugman model, of course, contains the variety effect, but not the productivity or selection effect, and it gets results closer to the Armington model, in some cases quite close. For individual regions, we get reverse welfare ranking. So these results don't hold for the region level. So you can get larger terms of trade effects in the Krugman and the Armington model sometimes, which will dominate the variety and productivity effects. So for individual regions, you can get reverse welfare ranking. And you can even get reverse welfare rankings between Krugman and Melitz. The different models, the number of varieties can change by sectors, and the variety effects can go in the opposite direction. and that that would cause the Krugman model to give you bigger gains in the balance model. So these are this inequality we have here is for global effects, but for individual regions we find exceptions. What are the key features of all these features we've introduced? It's intermediates and labor leisure choice. And there's an interaction effect between them, which magnifies their individual effects. So the labor leisure effect by itself gives you about 7% gain over Armington, but if it's together with the intermediates, it gives you about a 19% gain over Armington in the scenarios we ran. So this is an interaction effect. But if you don't have either of them in the model, you're likely to get results very close between these three market structures. That was the result. If you simply add vectors and don't do anything else to the Casanova, the Archilochus Casanova model, you get ambiguous welfare gains. So, but if you have intermediates and labor leisure choice, that makes a big difference. And the last scenario I want to discuss is a unilateral tariff change. So we simulated a unilateral increase in tariffs to 25% from whatever tariffs the 10 regions had, without retaliation, separately for each of the 10 regions in our full policy model. So and that's starting from whatever tariffs the countries had to begin with. You can get differences because they might start. Some countries start obviously with higher tariffs than others. So I should have mentioned virtually all data is from the GTAP data set. All 10 of our regions gain in the Armington model. so any region wants in Armington raising its tariffs to 25%. But 6 of the 10 regions lose in the Krugman model, and 7 of the regions lose in the knowledge model. But the majority of the 10 regions, the sign of the welfare effect is opposite. So there was the original question of do the welfare effects differ across market structures? Well, not only can they differ, but the sign of the welfare effect differ, and it can differ by substantial amount. Why? Well, the Armington model is well known for strong terms of trade gains from unilateral imposition of tariffs up to the optimal tariff. I should say that for elasticities in this model, we're trying to be consistent with structural gravity. We take the structural gravity estimate from the Belisari, Hilberry, Rutherford 2011 paper in the Journal of International Economics, where they estimate the K parameter at 4.6, which in a single sector is the structural gravity estimate. And that gives us an optimal tariff for these countries, both numerically and theoretically, in the range of 21 to 23%. So they raise their tariffs up to this level, they're gaining. They go above that to 25%, there's some losses, but the gains dominate in the Armington model. But in the monopolistically competitive model, there are losses from product variety externality, even for small increases in tariffs. And this works in the opposite direction of the terms of trade gain. Also, you have productivity losses in the knowledge model, so from tariff increases. So this dramatically lowers the optimal tariff in the monopolistic competition model. I think that's all I have to say. There obviously is a lot to cover in 20 minutes, so I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much, David. You are also perfectly on time. So now the floor is open for questions. So if anybody has questions, you can also feel free just to show up and ask your questions. So does anyone have any immediate questions? Otherwise, I can start with a few. Okay. All right. So thanks again, David. I have a few questions, and I guess my most immediate question would be, so going back to you shared an overview of 18 different models. So now you've done comparative simulations with all of these different versions. Though, of course, I guess in essence, you're just looking at a comparison of different extensions of Millet's, Krugman, and Armington. And I'm wondering if you have to pick one model for analysis, which do you really prefer and why? I imagine, of course, there's different trade-offs between the different models. And perhaps certain are tailored for certain analyses, and others are more suitable for other scenarios. So I'm wondering if you can just comment a bit on this.
Sure. It's very clear that if you're doing a policy exercise, it's those latter models at the bottom that you have to use in the policy model. The earlier models, I think I forgot to say it, although it was on my slides, that we took those first 15 or so variations to be transparent and to be to talk essentially to the theorists as well who like these small models and criticize us and saying we can't understand your models when you have 5,000 equations or something. So we start with the one sector model and do various exercises there, then go to 4 sectors and progressively introduce features. But if we're doing a policy exercise, you have to have a lot of. You want to go to the larger model, and then. But your question is still relevant even there. What we said is that what's really crucial is intermediates, and what we learned is labor leisure is quite important, because I think most of us, when we do these models, I don't think there's anybody in this audience who doesn't include intermediates in their models. So it doesn't include multiple primary factors. So there's, for a CGE modeler, there's nothing new here in that respect. But the labor leisure choice is something that a lot of us leave out many times. And what this is saying is that that's important. But this is, a response in large respect to the papers of Arkalakis, Costino, and Rodriguez-Clare, and then Costino and Rodriguez-Clare's paper in the Handbook of International Economics, where they were essentially arguing that if you are consistent with structural gravity, you're not going to get much of a welfare difference across the models, and we find very different results in that respect.
Okay, thank you for this nice response, and I note your questions in it, but I just have one follow-up though. So also my question, maybe it wasn't precise enough, but a little bit about the difference between the Armington, Krugman, and Millet's models. So again, a lot of us are still actually modeling under the standard Armington assumption. And now you were talking in the end, especially about the Millet's and the Krugman models, and they're more similar. So when you're doing your policy analyses, do you exclusively do this with Millet's, or is there a time when you're also using Krugman or Armington as well? And is there a reason that you might select one or the other? Do you find there's trade-offs, or do you really just exclusively look at Millet's?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I just did a big exercise with several colleagues in Ukraine, where the purpose was to transfer the model to Ukraine. And for that exercise, we chose not to do Millet's because we thought that it would be difficult effort to get multiple people in Ukraine to be able to run a model of that sort. And so in that case, we use Krugman. Of course, we do have foreign direct investment in services in that model, and that's something which, on the technical side, I don't know if we've solved that one from in a multi-region model. We've at Ballesteri and I have done Millet's model with foreign direct investment in a small open economy model, but not yet in a multi-region model. So that's one issue. If you want to do services in FDI, it's not really fully resolved yet. But also from the welfare perspective, we get big differences between Krugman and Armington when you start looking at variety, when you include variety, imperfect competition, variety effects, and especially FDI and services. We get big differences between the Krugman and the Armington story. So I think, people, in my experience, if you're working with trade policy people, trade government people in the trade policy field, with Armington, you often get the question of, well, if the results are so small, why are we incurring these adjustment costs? And why are we dealing with these political issues with kickback from our constituents with respect to our welfare effects? So I strongly believe that you need monopolistic competition in doing these policy exercises. Whether you need melons or not, I'm not so sure that that's what's needed for an effective policy discussion. But on the other hand, there are issues where, for example, in the first paper of this presentation, where I think the Melitz model is really important as well. So, where you're interested in, are some of the least efficient firms going to be eliminated? Well, I mean, if you're dealing Krugman, all the firms are the same. It's the same as perfect competition. In a sense, you get a certain share of the industry which goes out of business, and you don't get a sense of the distribution across the industry.
Okay, thank you very much, David. And now I want to first go to Zainab. Zainab, you had a question?
Thank you, Caitlin. Thanks, David, for the great presentation. Excuse me. Comparing all these columns actually puts the welfare comparison discussion in the literature into a good perspective, making everything very transparent. My question is about when we're doing these analytical exercises and policy analyses, we are always asked about how the Melitz model results are different than Armington model, and you showed different elasticity values and equalized trade and non-equalized trade when comparing these models. So, do you have any comments on which method to go for when we're comparing Armington and Melitz, say, to have trade responses equalized in the shocks, in the policy elasticity values chosen in what way? Do you have any comments on that?
I think there's really only one choice because of the requirement that the shape parameter be larger than the elasticity, Dixon Stiglitz elasticity -1. You don't have, if you try to, what we did was we started with the Melitz model, took the trade response from that, and then we can adjust up the Dixon Stiglitz elasticity in the Krugman model or the Armington elasticity. If you start with the Krugman model, which we did at one point, you're constrained by that. So you have a trade response in the Krugman model. In the Krugman model, from say an elasticity substitution, Dixon Stiglitz elasticity estimate, and then you go to the Melitz model, and you have you may not be able to satisfy the constraint of the Melitz model. So that's why we ended up computing the trade response in the Melitz model and then adjusting the elasticities in the other two, either the Dixon Stiglitz or the Armington elasticity. There's a footnote somewhere in one of our papers along the way which elaborates on this issue, but I don't think it's in the current version. But I think it's in the World Bank working paper version of our paper, which was a couple of years ago.
Thank you.
Okay, and now we have another question from Kazuhiko Oyamada. Would you like to show up and ask your question directly? Okay, otherwise I can go ahead and read the question. So it's, what do you think are the advantages to use the Krugman model, even though we already have the Mellitz model? I think you might have touched upon this, but maybe you can just talk about it a little bit.
Well, I mean, it will achieve significant differences from the Armington model, and I think they are differences that are based in empirical reality. That variety is important. You know, in our papers, the Weinstein, the Broda-Weinstein paper, for example, is an important empirical demonstration of that, of the importance of that, the variety effect, and the Krugman model captures that. You know, there are distributional issues within sectors that are important that are ignored by Krugman, the Krugman model, and you don't get the productivity effects in that model from the intrasectoral shifts. You do get productivity effects in the Krugman model from variety, lowering the cost of production when goods which are produced under monopolistic competition are used as intermediate inputs. You do get productivity effects there, but you know, so as I said before, we haven't figured out yet a good way of modeling FDI in a multi-region model with the Mellitz model. We have done it in the small open economy model, and we have done it in the Krugman model. So if you're interested in the multi-region model of services with FDI, so far you'd have to use Krugman unless you make the innovation yourself.
Okay, thank you for that question. Thank you for the response, David. Tom, I saw you also had a comment. I know it's also at the end of our session, but in case you just want to make a final comment.
Well, in addition to my role as timer saying times, yeah, let me thank the presenters, and of course, David and Ed have done a great job, a real benefit for the profession, carefully documenting all of this, both the derivations and the simulations. So thanks for that, David and Ed. But that's it. Time to wind it down. Get a coffee break, folks. Those of us on the East Coast definitely need a coffee break.
Yeah.
It's great seeing all you guys again.
Okay, well, thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you, Zainab, for organizing the session, and thank you, Tom, for hosting the session.